Every man in town said she could not break horses. She broke 14 in a week. The first horse was a blue roan gelding named Dust, who had thrown every man in Eldon County who had tried to sit him. He was 4 years old and 16 hands high, and he had a temper that the men at the Driscoll Ranch described as murderous, which was not accurate. Dust was not murderous. He was afraid, and the fear expressed itself as violence, because no one had taught him that there was a difference between the two, and no one had taught him because no one had tried. Lenora Pace arrived in Eldon, Wyoming Territory in April of 1887 on a stage from Cheyenne with a canvas bag, a pair of custom-made riding boots that had belonged to her father, and a letter of introduction from a horse trainer in Laramie named Corbin Walsh, who had written, in handwriting so small the words looked like insects crossing the page, "This woman knows horses better than any man I have trained, including myself, and I do not say that as a compliment to her. I say it as a fact, and facts do not require compliments." The letter was addressed to no one in particular. Corbin Walsh had written it as a general credential, the way a preacher writes a letter of good character, and the letter was Lenora's only professional reference, because she had spent the last 8 years working alongside her father, Arden Pace, who had been a horsebreaker of some reputation in southern Wyoming until a stroke had taken his right side and his speech in January, and left him in the care of Lenora's married sister in Laramie. And the care was good, and the sister was kind, but the sister's house had no room for Lenora, and no work for a woman whose only skill was the one skill that every man in Wyoming believed a woman could not possess. She was 29 years old, she was tall, 5 feet 9 inches, and she had her father's hands, which were large and square, and scarred across the knuckles from rope burns and bites, and the particular abrasions that come from working with animals, who weigh 1,200 pounds, and who do not understand the concept of gentleness until someone teaches it to them. She wore her dark hair braided and pinned under a hat that had been her father's, and the hat was too large for her head, but she wore it anyway, because the wearing was a connection to the man who had taught her everything, and who could no longer teach her anything, and the connection mattered more than the fit. She went to the Driscoll Ranch because the Driscoll Ranch had horses that needed breaking. Cal Driscoll had purchased a string of 20 Mustangs from a government sale, horses captured off the range near the Wind River, unbroken, unhandled, wild in the way that wild means not savage, but unfamiliar with humans, which is a different thing entirely, and the difference is the difference between danger and possibility. Cal Driscoll needed the horses broken for ranch work and for sale, and Cal Driscoll's regular horsebreaker had left for Montana in March, and the horses were eating hay and producing nothing, and Cal Driscoll was a man who did not like to pay for hay that produced nothing. She rode out to the Driscoll Ranch on a borrowed horse, and she found Cal Driscoll standing at the corral fence, watching the Mustangs circle the pen, 20 horses moving in a loose knot, ears back, tails switching, dust rising in a cloud that caught the afternoon light and turned it gold. Cal Driscoll was 53 years old, and he had ranched in Eldon County for 20 years, and he had opinions about everything, and the opinion he held most firmly was that a woman's relationship with a horse should be limited to sitting on one sideways in a split skirt, while a man led it by the halter. "I break horses," Lenora said. She handed him the letter from Corbin Walsh. Cal read the letter. He read it twice. He folded it and handed it back and said, "Corbin Walsh is a good man, but he has always been sentimental. I need these horses broken, not petted. I do not pet horses. I break them. There is a difference. Petting is what you do to a dog. Breaking is what you do to an animal that weighs 1,200 pounds and does not know that the weight can be shared." Cal looked at her. He looked at the boots, which were professional and worn. He looked at the hands, which were scarred in the right places. He looked at the hat, which was too large, and the braid, which was pinned tight, and the posture, which was the posture of a person who has spent more hours on horseback than on foot, and whose body has arranged itself accordingly. The slight forward lean, the loose shoulders, the feet planted wide. "The men will not like it," Cal said. "The men do not have to like it. The men have to watch me work and decide whether the work is good. If the work is good, It does not matter who does it. If the work is not good, I will leave and you will owe me nothing. How many can you break in a week? How many do you need? All 20. I will break 14 in a week. The other 6 will need more time, because they are the leaders, and the leaders are the last to trust. 2 weeks for the full string. Cal Driscoll agreed, because the agreement cost him nothing. She had offered to work on results, and results were the only currency Cal Driscoll respected. He gave her use of the bunkhouse tack room, which was a small room with a cot and a stove, and a door that locked. And the door that locked was the detail Lenora noticed first, because a woman working on a ranch full of men notices locks the way a sailor notices wind. The men did not like it. There were 4 of them. Hands who worked the Driscoll cattle and who had tried and failed to break the Mustangs themselves, and whose failure was now being answered by the arrival of a woman. And the arrival was, to them, an insult. Because the logic of their world held that if they could not do a thing, then a woman certainly could not do it. And the certainly was the foundation of their confidence. And the foundation was being questioned. And questioning a man's foundation is the fastest way to make him hostile. Wade Jessup was the loudest of the 4. He was 35, and he had broken horses for Cal Driscoll for 3 years. And he had been the one to declare Dust unrideable, which was not a declaration of fact but a declaration of surrender disguised as expertise. And the disguise was convincing, because Wade Jessup had the build and the voice of a man who knew what he was talking about. And the build and the voice were sufficient for most people, but they were not sufficient for horses. Because horses do not care about build or voice. Horses care about hands and weight and balance, and the particular quality of stillness that tells a 1,200-pound animal that the person on its back is not a threat but a partner. And Wade Jessup did not have that quality, because Wade Jessup approached horses the way he approached everything, as a contest. And horses do not respond to contests, they respond to conversations. Lenora started with Dust because Dust was the one they said could not be broken. And starting with the impossible is the fastest way to establish credibility, because credibility, once established with the impossible, extends automatically to everything else. She did not ride Dust on the first day. On the first day she stood in the corral with him. She stood still, and she let him circle her, and she breathed the way her father had taught her to breathe. Slowly, evenly, the exhale longer than the inhale, the body loose, the hands open, the eyes soft, looking at the horse without staring, because staring is a predator's behavior, and horses are prey animals, and a predator's stare triggers a prey animal's flight response, and the flight response is the enemy of trust, and trust is the only tool that matters. Dust circled her for 40 minutes. The men watched from the fence. Wade Jessup said, loud enough for Lenora to hear, "She is going to stand there until the horse dies of old age." The other men laughed. Lenora did not respond, because responding would have changed her breathing, and changing her breathing would have changed Dust's response. And Dust's response was more important than Wade Jessup's opinion, which was a hierarchy of importance that Wade Jessup would not have understood and did not need to understand, because the hierarchy was not for him. It was for the horse. At the end of 40 minutes, Dust stopped circling. He stopped and he turned his head toward Lenora, and his ears came forward. Both ears, not one, both. Which meant he was not monitoring a threat behind him, but focusing entirely on the person in front of him. And Lenora extended one hand, palm down, fingers loose. And Dust dropped his head and smelled her hand, and the smelling was the beginning, and the beginning was everything. On the second day, she touched him. On the third day, she put a blanket on his back. On the fourth day, she put a saddle on his back, and cinched it, and let him wear it, while she stood beside him, and breathed, and talked to him, in a voice that was low and steady, and continuous, the voice her father had used. The voice that said nothing in particular, because the words did not matter. The tone mattered. The steadiness mattered. The continuity mattered. The message that this voice would not stop, and would not change, and would not suddenly become a shout or a command. On the fifth day, she rode Dust. She put her foot in the stirrup, and she swung up, and she sat, and Dust stood still. He stood still because by the 5th day, the saddle was familiar, and the weight was expected, and the voice was trusted, and the hands on the reins were the hands that had been offered palm down on the 1st day, and the offering had been the promise, and the riding was the fulfillment, and the distance between promise and fulfillment was 4 days of patience, which is not a long time to a horse, but which is an eternity to a man standing at a fence, wanting to see a bronc buck. Wade Jessup watched from the fence. He watched Lenora ride Dust at a walk around the corral, once, twice, 3 times, and then at a trot, and then at a lope, and Dust moved smoothly and willingly, and the moving was not the broken obedience of an animal that has been beaten into submission, but the willing cooperation of an animal that has been asked and has answered. And the difference between beaten obedience and willing cooperation is the difference between a horse that works for 10 years and a horse that works for 2 years and then turns dangerous, because the beating taught it that humans are enemies and enemies must be fought. By the end of the 7th day, Lenora had broken 14 horses. She had broken them using the method her father had taught her, which was not a method at all but a philosophy. The philosophy that a horse is not a problem to be solved, but a relationship to be built. And relationships are built with time and patience and consistency, and the willingness to let the other party set the pace. And the pace is never as fast as the human wants it to be. And the slowness is not a failure but a feature, because the slowness is the time the trust needs to grow. The men stopped laughing after the 3rd horse. They stopped laughing because the evidence was accumulating, and the evidence was undeniable. The horses Lenora broke were not just broken. They were gentle. They were responsive. They moved under a rider the way a good horse moves, with attention and willingness, and the particular grace that comes from an animal that is working with its rider instead of against its rider. And the grace was visible even to men who did not want to see it. Wade Jessup did not stop. Wade Jessup watched the 14 horses and he said, on the evening of the 7th day, standing in the yard with Cal Driscoll and the other hands, any fool can pet a horse into walking in circles. Breaking a horse means the horse knows who is in charge. Those horses do not know who is in charge. Lenora was carrying a bucket of water from the pump. She set the bucket down. She looked at Wade Jessup the way she had looked at Dust on the 1st day, without staring, without challenging, with the soft-eyed assessment of a person who is reading an animal and deciding what the animal needs. And what Wade Jessup needed was not a fight but a demonstration, because a fight would have confirmed his belief that the issue was strength, and a demonstration would have proved that the issue was skill. Saddle Dust, she said. Ride him. Wade Jessup looked at her. He looked at Cal Driscoll. Cal Driscoll said nothing, which was permission, and Wade Jessup walked to the corral and saddled Dust, and put his foot in the stirrup and swung up, and Dust stood still. Dust stood still, because Dust had been taught to stand still, and the teaching was solid, and Wade Jessup sat on a horse that did not buck, did not fight, did not resist, and the not resisting was the proof, and the proof was sitting under him, and the proof was undeniable even to a man who wanted very badly to deny it. Wade Jessup rode Dust around the corral. He rode him at a walk and a trot and a lope, and Dust responded to every cue, the shift of weight, the pressure of knee, the movement of rein, and the responding was immediate and smooth and willing. And Wade Jessup dismounted, and he stood beside Dust, and he did not say anything, because there was nothing to say, because the horse had said everything. And what the horse had said was that competence is not a quality that belongs to one sex or the other. Competence belongs to whoever earns it, and Lenora Pace had earned it 14 times in 7 days. Cal Driscoll hired her for the remaining 6 horses. He hired her for the spring string the following year. He told every rancher in Eldon County that the woman with the letter from Corbin Walsh was the best horsebreaker he had ever employed, and the telling was not charity, it was advertising, because Cal Driscoll sold the 14 horses for prices that were 30% higher than he had expected, because the horses were better than he had expected. And the betterness was the direct result of a method that every man in town had said would not work, because the method was used by a woman, and the logic of their rejection was the logic of people who have never watched a blue roan gelding named Dust stand still for a woman, who taught him that standing still was safe. Lenora stayed in Eldon. She stayed because the work was good, and the work was steady, and the tack room had a lock on the door, and the lock was sufficient. She stayed because Cal Driscoll paid her the same rate he had paid his previous horsebreaker, and the paying the same was a form of respect that cost Cal nothing, but meant everything. She stayed because Wade Jessup, who had been the loudest in his objection, became the quietest in his observation, watching her work with the remaining 6 horses, the way a student watches a teacher, not with admiration, which implies hierarchy, but with attention, which implies learning, and the learning was the concession that Wade Jessup made to the evidence, and the concession was enough. She broke the 6 remaining horses in 10 days. The leaders, as she had predicted, took longer. Their trust came slower. Their resistance was deeper. Their willingness had to be earned at a price that the followers did not charge. But the trust came, and the resistance yielded, and the willingness arrived, and when the 20th horse was broken, Lenora Pace had done in 17 days what every man in Eldon County had said could not be done, and the not doing had been their failure, and the doing was hers, and the doing was the answer to every objection, and every laugh, and every loud opinion spoken from the safe side of a fence, by men who had tried and failed, and who had decided that their failure was the limit of possibility. It was not the limit of possibility. Lenora Pace was the proof that it was not, and the proof was standing in the corral. 20 horses, broken and gentle and willing, the evidence of a competence that did not care what the men in town said, because competence does not listen to opinions. Competence works, and the work speaks for itself.